Within the Reformed world, you have two schools of thought in the 19th century that were kind of competing. And though obviously there are similarities, there are also differences. Mercersburg Academy, home of the German Reformed Church Seminary, and Princeton Seminary became focal points for two opposing sides of the Reformed world, primarily through a heated theological debate between their leading professors. Now, obviously, I think most of us have heard of Philip Schaff, so he was with Mercersburg, and then you got Charles Hodge on the Princeton side. So we talked about the key proponents. Also later, B.B. Warfield, obviously another huge name in the Princeton world. All right, now I thought this was interesting, the theological method. Mercersburg emphasized a Christological and historical approach, drawing on German idealism, romanticism, and the idea of organic development in history. And that probably comes from Philip Schaff, the development of history. While many point to Princeton as employing Baconianism and Scottish common sense realism, leading to a more exegetical, logical, and scientific defense of Reformed orthodoxy. Now, this is a difference right here that will kind of show a lot of the results of American evangelicalism. Now, while Mercersburg Theological Seminary viewed the church as a divine, visible, organic institution essential for salvation, emphasizing its historical continuity and unity, Princeton tended to view the church as a collection of individual believers, an aid to individual piety, and less essential to the core of salvation. And I think many would charge American evangelicalism as individualistic. All right, here's another big hitter. The sacraments. Now, Mercersburg argued for a mystical presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper and objective efficacy in the sacrament, and advocated for a more formal altar-centered liturgy. And while Princeton held a more memorialistic or symbolic understanding of the Lord's Supper, often labeled Zwinglian, and they rejected any objective efficacy. And this is why you can see, like, such as Southern Seminary, and why many Southern Baptists, which is the big Baptist denomination in America, why they maybe hold more to a Zwinglian approach dominantly in the SBC, because Boyce, who studied at Princeton and then started and founded Southern Seminary. So you can kind of see the connection, and obviously he was influenced by Princeton and set up his institution much like it. Overall tendency, they saw a Reformed Catholicity willing to learn from aspects of Catholic and Orthodox theology to recover lost sacramental and traditional dimensions, while Princeton championed strict fidelity to the Reformed confessions, viewing Mercersburg's ideas as dangerously close to Roman Catholicism. Now, this is an AI overview, but going through some articles and listening to Mark Knoll, who is arguing kind of against the Princeton side in many ways, he's saying a lot of these same things. And he is a professor, I believe, still at Notre Dame. And he has wrote specifically on this topic as far as the evangelical mind. So the debate specifically over the Lord's Supper were sharp, but ultimately the Princeton position became predominant in American Protestantism. Now, here's a lot of the argument. The Princetonians from Princeton cultivated an intellectual regression of the Reformed evangelical tradition through their embrace of Scottish common sense realism. And you'll see this position like through mostly just Mark Knoll, who I've read and listened to. But this view, which has been described as the commonly accepted view, it asserts that Enlightenment ideals, particularly a modernist system of thought, crept into Princetonian theology via the Scottish common sense realism. The argument is that the price that Princeton paid for this alignment was the loss of its Reformation bearings and a suffering of its Augustinian piety. Grounding their theology in common sense truths, which shape their understanding of biblical interpretation and apologetics. In contrast, German mediating theology influenced them through the study of German-educated theologians who sought to balance faith with modern science and philosophy, often through translation and transatlantic scholarly connections. The Princetonians integrated Scottish realism into their foundational theology. So this philosophy asserts individuals have self-evident truths accessible through reason, which they apply to their theological system. Now, on the opposite side of this, Richard Muller who's huge in like Reformed history and the books in that world, but he argues that Francis Turretin and the Princeton theologians were not corrupters of the Reformed tradition, but rather stood in essential continuity with it. He challenges the idea of the, quote, Calvin against the Calvinists thesis, which claimed that later Reformed scholastic thinkers, including Francis Turretin, moved away from Calvin's original theology towards a dry, rationalistic, or deterministic system. Muller says that while post-Reformation divines like Francis Turretin used a different, more structured scholastic methodology than the first-generation reformers, they remained in fundamental agreement with them on core doctrinal content. He also views Protestant scholasticism not as a corruption, but as an appropriate method for developing and teaching the Reformed system within an academic context. And so the Princeton theologians, in drawing from Francis Turretin, were thus inheriting a robust, consistent expression of the broader Reformed tradition, one that had developed naturally from the Reformation era in response to various historical and intellectual challenges. So Muller argues for a more complex and continuous historical development where Francis Turretin and the Princetonians are faithful representatives of a mature Reformed orthodoxy, not corrupters of its original intent. So you kind of see both sides of the argument. You see the differences in the Mercersburg and the Princeton kind of argument. You see that American evangelicalism kind of connected more to the Princetonian ideals. And then you also see the argument coming from Muller that Princeton didn't ruin Reformed theology. But I definitely think this debate in this kind of area of thought and wondering how we got to where we are today in many ways, it's an interesting thought in looking at this debate.